The marble floors of the Ashworth estate gleamed in the early morning light, reflecting the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls throughout the sprawling mansion. Ethan Ashworth moved through his domain with the precision of a man who had built an empire on calculated decisions and unwavering control. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished stone as he descended the grand staircase, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his mind already 3 steps ahead of the day's demands. The business trip to Singapore had been planned for months. 3 days of high-stakes negotiations with international investors, meetings that could expand his technology conglomerate into Asian markets worth billions. His assistant had prepared briefing documents 2 inches thick. His private jet was being fueled at the airstrip. Everything was arranged with the mechanical efficiency that defined Ethan's life since Rebecca's death 4 years ago. He didn't notice the small figure watching him from behind the potted orchid near the kitchen entrance. Little Isla Martinez, just 3 years old, clutched her worn stuffed rabbit and observed the tall man with the serious face as he gave instructions to his driver. Her mother, Maria, the estate's head housekeeper, was busy in the kitchen preparing breakfast, unaware that her daughter had slipped away from her coloring books. Isla had learned to be quiet in the big house. She understood, in the wordless way children understand the unspoken rules of adult worlds, that Mr. Ashworth preferred silence, order, and invisibility from those who maintained his home. For 6 months, since her mother had accepted this position after Isla's father disappeared back to Honduras, the little girl had perfected the art of being small. But today was different. Today, something in her chest felt tight and scared. She recognized the large black suitcase by the door. Her papa had brought one just like it the night he said goodbye. He'd promised to come back, promised to send for them, promised that the backpack he carried meant adventure, not abandonment. That was 8 months ago. The suitcase meant leaving. The suitcase meant gone. Ethan checked his watch, a platinum Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. His CFO would be waiting at the airport in 40 minutes. He reached for his briefcase when he heard it, a small shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. He turned, his executive instincts alert to anything out of place in his meticulously ordered environment. What he saw stopped him completely. Isla stood in the hallway, her dark curls slightly disheveled, wearing a pink dress with butterflies that Maria had carefully ironed the night before. But it wasn't the child herself that arrested his attention. It was the tiny backpack she was pulling behind her, a worn purple thing decorated with cartoon princesses, packed so full that the zipper strained. She looked at him with enormous brown eyes that held a determination far beyond her years. "I go too," she announced, her small voice steady despite the trembling of her lower lip. Her chubby fingers gripped the backpack strap with white-knuckled intensity. For a moment, Ethan simply stared. In his world of boardrooms and mergers, of stock options and hostile takeovers, he'd faced down corporate raiders, government regulators, and competitors who wanted to destroy everything he'd built. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. But he found himself completely unprepared for the sight of a 3-year-old child, packed and ready, insisting on accompanying him into his carefully compartmentalized life. "Isla, sweetheart, come back to the kitchen." Maria's voice came from behind them, laced with mortification and worry. She rushed forward, wiping her hands on her apron, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashworth. She must have seen your luggage and—" "I go with Mr. Eden," Isla insisted, pronouncing his name the way she always did, turning the into a T that somehow made it sound gentler. She stepped forward, dragging her backpack another few inches toward a suitcase. "I have my things. I'm ready." Maria reached for her daughter's hand, but Isla pulled back, her small face setting into lines of stubborn resolve. "Please, Mama. I need to go. He has a bag like Papa's. He's leaving like Papa." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd made it his business to know nothing about his staff's personal lives beyond their efficiency and reliability. Maria was an excellent housekeeper, quiet, thorough, and she kept the child out of his way. That was all that mattered. But now, looking at the determination and barely concealed terror in Isla's eyes, he realized there were stories in his house he'd deliberately chosen not to hear. "Isla, mi amor, Mr. Ashworth is going to work," Maria explained gently, kneeling to her daughter's level. "He's coming back. This is his home. He's not like—" She stopped, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's not leaving forever." "But Papa's bag looked the same," Isla whispered, and now the tears did come, rolling down her round cheeks. "And Papa didn't come back. The bag means gone." Ethan found himself kneeling too, his expensive suit forgotten as he lowered himself to meet those heartbroken eyes. Up close, he could see that her backpack was carefully packed with a motley collection of necessities as understood by a 3-year-old. The stuffed rabbit, a picture book about a lost dog, a plastic container of Cheerios, and what looked like every piece of clothing she owned, stuffed in with the precise disorder of childhood determination. She'd prepared for a journey. She'd armed herself against abandonment the only way she knew how, by refusing to be left behind. Something cracked in Ethan's chest. Some wall he'd built brick by careful brick after Rebecca's sudden death had left him alone in this enormous house with nothing but his work to fill the silence. He'd insulated himself from feeling, from connection, from anything that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. But this child, with her purple backpack and her brave, broken heart, had found a fissure in his armor he didn't know existed. "May I see what you've packed?" he asked quietly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. Isla hesitated, then nodded. She unzipped the backpack with fumbling fingers and began removing items one by one, narrating their necessity with the serious logic of a toddler. "Bunny, because he gets scared alone. Cheerios, because journeys are long. My yellow shirt, my blue pants, my socks with the stars. And this." She pulled out a creased photograph of herself with Maria and a man Ethan assumed was her father, all three of them laughing at some unseen joke, frozen in a moment of joy that no longer existed. "So Papa can find me wherever we go," she explained, her voice breaking on the last word. Ethan looked at Maria, who had tears streaming down her face now. One hand pressed to her mouth, as if to hold back sobs. Then he looked at his watch, at his suitcase, at the door that led to his waiting car, and his waiting jet and his waiting empire. And then he looked back at Isla, who was watching him with an expression that expected disappointment, because disappointment was what she'd learned to expect from men with suitcases. "Well," Ethan said slowly, "if you're coming along, we need to make sure you have everything you need." The words hung in the air like a spell that, once spoken, could never be taken back. Maria's eyes widened in shock, her hand dropping from her mouth to reach instinctively toward her daughter. Ethan could see the conflict playing across her face, gratitude at his kindness warring with the impossibility of what he was suggesting and the fear of overstepping boundaries that governed their employer-employee relationship. "Mr. Ashworth, you don't have to, she can't possibly," Maria stammered, her professional composure crumbling under the weight of maternal concern and workplace protocol. Ethan held up a hand, then pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant with the same decisiveness he brought to every business decision, except this one felt different. This one made his heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the small girl still clutching her backpack, her tears stopped mid-track by confusion and the fragile bloom of hope. "Jennifer, change of plans," he said when his assistant answered. "I need you to book 2 additional seats on the jet." He paused, looking at Maria with a raised eyebrow that was both question and invitation. 3 additional seats. Maria Martinez and her daughter will be accompanying me. I'll need a 2-bedroom suite at the hotel instead of my usual accommodation, adjoining rooms. And contact that family services consultant we used for the Children's Hospital charity event. I need age-appropriate activities, childcare recommendations, and whatever else a 3-year-old might need in Singapore. You have 20 minutes. He could hear Jennifer's pause, the subtle recalibration of someone who'd worked for him long enough to know that questions would only slow the process. Consider it done, Mr. Ashworth. Should I reschedule any of your meetings to accommodate?
No.
The meetings proceed as planned. Just ensure appropriate arrangements are made for my guests. When he hung up, Maria was shaking her head in disbelief. Mr. Ashworth, this is incredibly generous, but I can't accept. Your business trip, your important meetings, a child would be completely inappropriate. And I have responsibilities here, the house. The house will survive 3 days without you, Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Mrs. Chun can manage the staff. As for my meetings, they're important, but not more important than, he stopped, uncertain how to finish the sentence. More important than what? Than keeping a promise to a 3-year-old? Than proving to a heartbroken child that not every man with a suitcase disappeared forever? Than fixing something he hadn't even known was broken until 10 minutes ago? Isla had been watching this exchange with the intensity of someone whose fate hung in the balance. Now she stepped forward and slipped her small hand into Ethan's larger one. Her fingers were sticky, from breakfast he assumed, and impossibly tiny against his palm. The gesture was so trusting, so completely unearned, that he felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. "I'll be very good," she whispered. "I promise. I won't touch anything, and I'll be quiet like Mama says, and I'll eat all my vegetables, even the green ones." Ethan found himself squeezing her hand gently. "I'm sure you will be. But Isla, I need you to understand something." He knelt again, bringing himself to her level. "I am coming back. This trip, my suitcase, the airplane, it's all temporary. In 3 days, we'll come home together. All of us. This isn't like when your papa left." The words felt inadequate even as he said them. How could he promise this child anything when her experience had taught her that promises from men were made of smoke? But her eyes searched his face with an intensity that felt like it could see straight through to his soul, weighing his words against everything she'd learned about trust and loss. "You promise?" she asked finally. "Promise you come back?" "I promise," Ethan said, and felt the weight of that commitment settle over him like an oath. "And to prove it, you're coming with me. You'll see the whole trip, and then you'll see me bring you home. So you'll know that people can leave and still come back." Maria made a small sound, half sob and half laugh, and wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Mr. Ashworth, I don't know what to say. This is beyond kind, but the expense, the inconvenience, is irrelevant," Ethan finished. He stood, still holding Isla's hand, and looked at Maria with an expression that brooked no argument. "I'm not doing this out of charity, Maria. I'm doing it because your daughter just taught me something about courage that I'd forgotten. She packed a bag and decided to fight against being left behind. That's the kind of determination that builds empires. The least I can do is show her it's okay to trust again." The truth was more complicated than he was willing to articulate. The truth was that somewhere in Isla's brave, desperate attempt to avoid abandonment, Ethan had seen an echo of himself after Rebecca died, the way he'd thrown himself into work, packing his own metaphorical bag with mergers and acquisitions and strategic plans, anything to avoid being left alone with his grief. He'd been running from loss by staying constantly in motion, just as Isla was trying to run from loss by literally following him. Maybe they both needed to learn how to come home. The next 20 minutes were a controlled chaos that Ethan's household had never witnessed. Jennifer called back with confirmations and itineraries. Maria rushed to pack proper luggage for herself and Isla, her hands shaking as she folded tiny clothes and gathered toiletries. Mrs. Chun, the estate manager, appeared and received her instructions with characteristic calm, though her eyes kept drifting to Isla with undisguised curiosity. Ethan found himself sitting in his study with Isla on the leather couch beside him while Maria packed, the little girl having refused to let him out of her sight. She'd opened her picture book about the lost dog and was narrating the story to him with complete seriousness, showing him each illustration and explaining the plot with the assumption that he was as invested in the dog's journey as she was. And then Max is very scared because he doesn't know where his home is, she explained, pointing to a picture of a cartoon dog looking worried in a big city. But he's brave. He keeps going because brave means you're scared, but you do it anyway. Mama told me that. Your mama is very wise, Ethan said, finding himself actually looking at the pictures, actually listening to the story. Are you brave? Isla asked suddenly, turning those enormous eyes on him. Mama says you're very important and very busy. But are you brave? The question caught him off guard. Was he brave? He'd thought so once. He'd built a company from nothing, taken risks that made his board of directors nervous, competed in markets where failure meant losing everything. But sitting here with this child, being asked to prove that trust wasn't futile and promises weren't empty, he wasn't sure he'd ever done anything that required real courage. I'm going to try to be, he said honestly. Sometimes being brave means doing something you've never done before, even when it's scary. Like taking a 3-year-old on a business trip. Isla giggled, a sound like bells that Ethan realized he'd never heard in his house before. Children's laughter. When had this place gone so silent? Maria appeared in the doorway with 2 proper suitcases, her composure mostly restored though her eyes still showed traces of tears. We're ready, Mr. Ashworth. And I thank you for seeing her. For understanding. Thank you for raising someone who knows how to fight for what she needs, Ethan replied, standing and offering his hand to Isla. Shall we begin our adventure? Isla took his hand without hesitation this time, then reached for her mother's hand with the other. Adventure, she repeated solemnly. Like Max the dog. And at the end, we all come home. At the end, Ethan confirmed, we all come home. As they walked to the waiting car, Isla's purple backpack safely stored with the luggage, but her stuffed rabbit clutched firmly in her free arm, Ethan caught his reflection in one of the hall mirrors. He barely recognized the man looking back. The same suit, the same features, but something in his expression had softened, opened. For the first time in 4 years, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum of his past. It felt like something he might actually want to return to. The driver held open the car door, his professional mask slipping for just a moment into surprise at the sight of his employer helping a small child into the back seat. As Ethan fastened Isla's seatbelt, checking it twice to ensure it was secure, he wondered what his board of directors would think if they could see him now. The feared CEO who'd just rearranged an international business trip to accommodate a toddler and her mother. He decided he didn't care. The private jet gleamed in the morning sun, its sleek white body emblazoned with the Ashworth Technologies logo. Ethan had made this journey dozens of times, settling into his usual routine of reviewing contracts and financial projections while cruising at 40,000 feet. But nothing about this trip would be usual. Isla's reaction to the aircraft made him see it through completely new eyes. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her small mouth forming a perfect O of amazement, her grip on her mother's hand tightening not from fear but from the overwhelming enormity of what she was witnessing. Mama, she whispered, though her whisper carried clearly in the quiet of the private airstrip. It's so big. We're going to fly in that. Maria smiled, her own nervousness about this unprecedented situation momentarily forgotten in her daughter's wonder. Yes, mi cielo. We're going to fly all the way across the ocean. Like birds. Like very fancy birds, Ethan found himself saying, and was rewarded with Isla's delighted giggle. The flight attendant, Caroline, who'd been with Ashworth Technologies for 5 years, managed to keep her professional composure despite the shock of seeing her typically solitary employer boarding with a woman and small child. To her credit, she adapted immediately, greeting Maria warmly and kneeling down to Isla's level. Welcome aboard. I'm Caroline. Would you like to see where you'll be sitting? Isla nodded shyly, then looked up at Ethan as if asking permission. The gesture struck him deeply, This child, who'd been so bold in declaring her intention to accompany him, now sought his approval for the smallest things. He nodded encouragingly, and Isla let Caroline lead her into the cabin. The interior of the jet was designed for business. Leather seats that converted to beds, a conference table, individual workstations with the latest technology. Isla moved through it like she was exploring a palace, her eyes wide, her hands carefully clasped behind her back as if afraid to touch anything in this adult world of luxury. "You can sit anywhere you'd like," Caroline told her, gesturing to the seats. Isla looked at each option with the seriousness of someone making a life-altering decision. Finally, she pointed to the seat directly across from where Ethan usually sat.
"There.
So I can see Mr. Etten." Something in his throat tightened. She wanted to see him, to keep him in sight, to make sure he didn't disappear. Once they were airborne, Ethan attempted to review the briefing documents for his first meeting. He lasted approximately 7 minutes before Isla's questions began. "Mr. Etten? Why are we in the clouds?" He looked up from a paragraph about semiconductor tariffs to find her peering out the window with fascination. "We're actually above the clouds now. We fly higher than the clouds, so the trip is smoother." "Are the birds up here too?" "Different kinds of birds. Some birds fly very high, but they're usually a bit lower than we are now."
"Oh."
She considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Do they get tired?" "The birds?" "Sometimes. That's why they land to rest." "Like we'll land in Singapore?" "Exactly like that." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to looking out the window. Ethan managed another paragraph before the next question. "What's Singapore?" Maria, seated beside her daughter, started to apologize, but Ethan waved her off. He closed his briefing folder and moved to sit beside Isla, pulling up a map on his tablet. "Singapore is a country right here," he said, pointing to the small island nation. "It's very far from where we live. The plane has to fly for many hours to get there." "Why do you have to go there?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Why did he have to go anywhere? The meetings could be conducted via video conference. The contracts could be negotiated by his team. But he'd learned long ago that presence mattered, that showing up in person demonstrated commitment and seriousness. Except now, looking at Isla's curious face, he wondered if he'd been showing up in the wrong places. "I have to talk to some people about work," he said finally. "About computers and technology. Very boring adult stuff."
"Oh."
Another thoughtful pause. "Will I be bored?" The question made him laugh, surprising himself. "You know what? I think we can find some things that aren't boring." "Caroline, what do we have in terms of entertainment?" What followed was a transformation of his typical flight experience. Caroline produced coloring books and crayons from some storage compartment Ethan had never known existed. Maria helped Isla settle at the conference table with her art supplies, and soon the cabin that usually echoed with the clicking of keyboard keys filled with the sound of a child humming tunelessly while she colored. Ethan tried once more to focus on his work, but found his attention drifting to the picture taking shape across the table. Isla was creating what appeared to be a family portrait, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. He could identify Maria by the dark hair and dress. There was a smaller figure that was clearly Isla herself. And there, rendered in careful black crayon, was a tall figure with broad shoulders. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to the dark figure. Isla looked up, her face serious. "That's you. You're with us.
"See?
You didn't leave." She pointed to the hands she'd drawn connecting all the figures. "Everyone's together." Ethan felt his eyes burn with an emotion he couldn't name. This child, who'd known him for all of 6 months and had never received more than a distant nod from him, had drawn him into her family, had literally illustrated the promise he'd made, that leaving didn't have to mean gone forever. "That's a beautiful picture," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You can have it," Isla said generously, "for your important work bag. So you remember." "Remember what?" "That we're waiting for you. That you have to come back." He took the picture carefully, as if it were the most valuable contract he'd ever signed. I'll keep it with me. I promise. The hours passed in a way Ethan had never experienced on a business flight. There were more questions about clouds, about why the sky was blue, about whether fish knew they were wet, about 100 other topics that his Harvard MBA had left him completely unprepared to answer. Maria apologized repeatedly until Ethan finally asked her to stop. She's curious. That's good. That's how people learn, he said, surprised to find he meant it. He showed Isla how to use the tablet, downloading educational games and interactive stories. She was a quick learner, her small fingers navigating the technology with the ease of her generation. When she got frustrated with a particularly difficult puzzle, he found himself helping her, the two of them working together to solve it. We did it, she exclaimed when the final piece clicked into place, and her joy was so genuine, so pure, that Ethan felt it resonating in his own chest. Somewhere over the Pacific, Caroline's served lunch. Ethan watched in amazement as Isla carefully ate her vegetables first, just as she'd promised, making a show of chewing each bite with exaggerated thoroughness. When she'd earned her fruit and cheese, she ate with the satisfied dignity of someone who'd fulfilled their obligations. You keep your promises, Ethan observed. Isla nodded seriously. Promises are important. Mama says if you don't keep promises, people stop believing you. The simple wisdom of it struck him. How many promises had he made to himself over the years? To slow down, to take time off, to let people in? And how many had he broken, convincing himself that work was more important, that connection could wait, that he had time? When Isla's eyelids began to droop, Maria settled her daughter in one of the seats that converted to a bed, covering her with a soft blanket. The little girl fought sleep for a few minutes, her eyes darting to Ethan as if to confirm he was still there. I'm not going anywhere, he assured her.
Sleep.
When you wake up, we'll be almost there. Promise, she mumbled, already halfway to dreams. Promise. As Isla slept, Ethan finally turned to Maria, who'd been quietly reading, trying to stay out of the way. Tell me about her father, he said quietly, if you're comfortable doing so.
Maria looked surprised, then sad.
She set down her book and took a breath. He had dreams. Big dreams about making money in America, bringing us to a better life. He worked construction, sent money home to Honduras for his mother. But it was never enough. He took a job that promised more money, promised papers, promised everything. He packed his bag and said he'd be back in 3 months. And he never came back. Ethan finished gently. We don't know. The company wasn't real. The men he went with, some of them we heard from, others just disappeared. Maybe he's still trying to get back. Maybe he. She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Isla was 2.5. Old enough to remember him leaving. Old enough to wait for him. I'm sorry, Ethan said, inadequate words for an enormous loss. She's so young, but she understands that men leave. That's why this morning, when she saw your suitcase. Maria's voice cracked. She's been having nightmares. Waking up afraid. I didn't realize she connected the suitcases until today. Ethan looked at the sleeping child, her face peaceful in rest, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. She'd been carrying this fear, packing her bag against it, preparing to fight abandonment the only way she knew how. And he'd almost walked out the door without seeing her, without understanding that sometimes the most important business was the kind that happened in your own hallway with a 3-year-old and a purple backpack. Thank you for telling me, he said to Maria. And thank you for trusting me with her. You gave her something today she desperately needed, Maria said softly. You showed her that not every departure is forever. That's a gift I couldn't give her on my own. Ethan wasn't sure that was true. He wasn't sure he was capable of being anyone's hero or role model. But he was sure of one thing. He was going to keep his promise. To Isla, to Maria, to himself. They would all come home together. He pulled out his laptop, intending to work, but instead found himself looking at Isla's drawing, now carefully stored in his briefcase. 3 stick figures holding hands. A family. A promise illustrated in crayon. He thought about Rebecca, about how she'd always wanted children, about how he'd said they had time, about how time had run out without warning on a rainy Tuesday when a distracted driver ran a red light. He'd sealed off that part of himself, the part that wanted connection and family and love. It was safer to focus on things he could control, numbers, strategies, growth projections. But Isla, with her impossible bravery and her 3-year-old wisdom, had reminded him that some things couldn't be controlled. Trust couldn't be strategized. Love couldn't be optimized. Sometimes you just had to pack your bag, take someone's hand, and have faith that the journey would lead you home. Singapore greeted them with the humid embrace of tropical evening, the city-state's skyline glittering like a circuit board come to life. As their car wound through streets lined with impossibly tall buildings and manicured gardens, Isla pressed her face to the window, taking in a world that was utterly unlike anything in her experience. "It's so pretty," she breathed, watching the lights of Marina Bay Sands reflect off the water. Like Christmas, but everywhere. The hotel was one of Singapore's finest, a tower of glass and steel that catered to international businesspeople and wealthy travelers. The lobby was all marble and modern art, with staff who moved with practiced efficiency. Ethan had stayed here a dozen times, checking in with minimal interaction before disappearing into his suite to prepare for meetings. Tonight was different. The concierge's eyes widened almost imperceptibly when Ethan approached the desk with Maria and Isla. Professional training took over immediately, but Ethan caught the moment of surprise. He supposed he made an unusual picture, the billionaire businessman holding the hand of a small child while her mother checked in their luggage. "Mr. Ashworth, welcome back. We have your suite ready, and as requested, we've prepared the adjoining rooms with accommodations for your guests." The concierge slid papers across the desk, then addressed Maria directly, with careful respect. "Ms. Martinez, we've taken the liberty of arranging some children's amenities in your room. If there's anything else your daughter needs, please don't hesitate to ask." "Say thank you," Maria prompted gently. "Thank you," Isla repeated dutifully, though she was clearly overwhelmed by the opulence around her. Their rooms were on the 42nd floor, connected by an interior door that Ethan made sure to prop open. His suite was familiar territory, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a workspace with multiple monitors, a bedroom that felt more like a showroom than a place to rest. But the adjoining suite, which he entered to inspect, had been transformed by the hotel staff based on Jennifer's requests. There were toys carefully arranged on a low table, building blocks, picture books, art supplies. The bedroom featured a regular bed for Maria and a smaller bed that had been made up with cheerful linens featuring friendly animals. There was even a small basket of child-friendly snacks and a stuffed animal tiger, Singapore's symbolic animal, waiting on Isla's pillow. Mr. Ettenlook. Isla had discovered the tiger, holding it up with delight. "He's so soft." "He's yours to keep," Ethan said, watching her face light up. "To remember Singapore." "I'll name him Sing," she declared. "Sing the tiger. And he can be friends with Bunny." As Maria helped Isla settle in, drawing a bath and unpacking their clothes, Ethan returned to his own suite and confronted his schedule. His first meeting was at 8 the next morning, a breakfast session with the heads of 3 major Asian tech firms. It would be followed by presentations, negotiations, a working lunch, more meetings, and a formal dinner. The entire day was blocked out in 30-minute increments, each moment accounted for and purposeful. He looked through the connecting door, where he could hear Isla's laughter echoing from the bathroom, Maria's gentle voice singing a song in Spanish. For the first time in years, his perfectly planned schedule felt suffocating rather than comforting. His phone buzzed. "Jennifer, checking in." "We've landed safely," he confirmed. "Tomorrow's schedule, I need modifications." There was a pause. Jennifer had worked for him long enough to know that mid-trip schedule changes were unheard of. What kind of modifications? Block out noon to 2. I need those hours clear. Sir, that's your working lunch with the representatives from Tokyo Tech. They've flown in specifically. Move it to dinner. Make it a social occasion rather than a working meal. The negotiations will go better with wine anyway. And, Jennifer, for future trips, I need to remember that sometimes the most important meetings are the ones not on the calendar. Another pause. Then, with a warmth he rarely heard from his efficient assistant, "Understood, Mr. Ashworth. I'll make the arrangements." That night, Ethan found himself sitting on the floor of Maria and Isla's suite, helping the little girl build a tower from the blocks. It should have felt ridiculous, a billionaire CEO in his shirt sleeves, following the architectural directions of a 3-year-old. But instead, it felt like the most honest thing he'd done in years. "No, Mr. Etten," Isla corrected him seriously. "The blue one goes there. It has to be blue, or the tower won't be strong." "My apologies. Blue it is." He placed the block where she indicated. Maria watched from the small sofa, a smile playing at her lips. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Ashworth. I know you have work to prepare for tomorrow." "The work will be there in an hour," he said, surprising himself. "Right now, I'm learning about structural integrity from a master architect." Isla giggled, delighted by being called a master anything. "I'm not a market. I'm just Isla." "Architect," Ethan corrected gently. "Someone who designs buildings." "Oh, like this." She gestured proudly at their tower, which was indeed impressive by the standards of 3-year-old engineering. They finished the tower together, and Isla insisted on leaving it standing overnight so everyone who comes in can see how tall it is. When Maria finally announced bedtime, Isla's face fell, but she accepted the inevitable with the resignation of children everywhere. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked Ethan as Maria began the bedtime routine. "I'll be here in the morning for breakfast," he promised. "And I'll be back in the afternoon. We'll do something special." "What's special?" "It's a surprise. But I promise you'll like it." That night, as Ethan finally tackled his briefing documents, he found his mind wandering to logistics that had nothing to do with market penetration or profit margins. What would a 3-year-old enjoy in Singapore? What could he show her that would make this trip memorable for the right reasons rather than traumatic? He picked up his phone and called the concierge. "I need recommendations. Family-friendly activities, suitable for a young child. Tomorrow afternoon, 2 hours." He paused, thinking. Something with animals, perhaps? Or nature. Something that would make a little girl smile. The concierge's professionalism couldn't quite mask his surprise, but he rallied beautifully. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Might I suggest the Singapore Zoo, or perhaps Gardens by the Bay? The Cloud Forest Dome is quite spectacular, and children typically find it magical." "Gardens by the Bay," Ethan decided. "Arrange transportation and tickets. 3 people, tomorrow at noon." The next morning's meetings went well, exceptionally well, actually. Ethan found himself more focused than usual, more present. Perhaps it was knowing that the day had a different kind of deadline, that there were people waiting for him who measured time not in billable hours but in promises kept. He negotiated with precision, but also with a new awareness that every minute spent in this conference room was a minute away from something that suddenly mattered more than market share. When he returned to the hotel just before noon, he found Isla and Maria waiting in their suite, the little girl dressed in a yellow sundress that Maria must have packed with more optimism than expectation that it would be needed. "Are you ready for your surprise?" Ethan asked. Isla nodded vigorously, taking his offered hand. "I've been so ready, Mama, and I guessed what it might be. Is it ice cream? Or puppies?" Mama said probably not puppies. "Your mama is right, but I think you'll like it anyway." Gardens by the Bay was otherworldly, a vast complex of futuristic structures and natural beauty, where technology and nature merged into something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction story. But it was the cloud forest that took Isla's breath away. They entered through a tunnel that opened into an enormous dome housing a 40-meter-tall artificial mountain, covered in lush vegetation and shrouded in mist. A waterfall cascaded down its face, and elevated walkways spiraled around and through the structure, offering views from different heights. The air was cool and humid, filled with the sound of falling water and exotic birdsong. Isla stopped walking, her mouth open in wonder, her small hand tightening in Ethan's grip. "Is this real?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It's real," Ethan confirmed, finding himself smiling at her reaction. "Shall we explore?" What followed was 2 hours that Ethan would later count among the most important of his life. They walked the elevated pathways, Isla exclaiming over every plant, every butterfly, every new wonder. Maria took photos on her phone, capturing her daughter's joy and, without quite meaning to, capturing the transformation in Ethan's face, the way his usual stern expression had softened into something approaching wonder. "Mr. Eden, look at the trees. They're upside down." Isla pointed to the inverted tree structures, hanging from the ceiling in a surreal display. "They've created an entire forest inside a building," Ethan explained, but he was as awed as she was. When had he last taken time to simply look at something beautiful without thinking about its practical applications or market potential? At the highest walkway, they paused to look down at the waterfall and the gardens below. Isla was quiet for a moment, taking it all in, then she looked up at Ethan with complete seriousness. "This is the best surprise ever," she said. "Better than ice cream. Better than puppies even." "I'm glad you like it," Ethan said, and realized he was genuinely, deeply happy, a feeling that had been absent from his life for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Can I tell you a secret?" Isla asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Of course." She tugged on his hand until he knelt down to her level. Then, with the gravity of someone sharing something profound, she said, "I was scared you would forget us. That you would go to your meetings and remember you're important and busy, and we would be stuck here like forgotten toys. But you came back. Right when you promised." Ethan felt his throat close up. "I'll always come back when I promise, Isla. That's what promises mean. Even when you're very busy?" "Even when I'm very busy. Especially then." He pulled out his phone and showed her the drawing she'd made on the plane, which he'd photographed and set as his lock screen.
"See?
I kept your picture. It reminds me what's important." Isla studied the image of her stick figures, then looked at Ethan, then at her mother, who was watching this exchange with tears streaming down her face. "We're important?" "Very important," Ethan confirmed. "You're the most important meeting I have all day." She threw her small arms around his neck in a hug that nearly knocked him over. Ethan, who hadn't been hugged in longer than he could remember, felt his own eyes burning as he wrapped his arms carefully around her small frame, this brave little girl who'd reminded him what it meant to be human. The rest of the Singapore trip took on a rhythm that Ethan had never experienced in his years of business travel. His mornings were filled with meetings and negotiations, where he found himself strangely more effective than usual. Perhaps it was the knowledge that each session had a definite end time, that there were people waiting for him who measured his worth in kept promises rather than closed deals. Or perhaps it was simply that he was remembering how to be a whole person rather than just a corporate entity. His afternoons belonged to Isla and Maria. They explored Singapore's gardens, visited the aquarium where Isla pressed her face against the glass to watch sharks glide past with terrifying grace, and spent an hour in a bookstore where Ethan bought enough children's books to fill a small library. Each evening, they had dinner together in the hotel restaurant, where the staff quickly grew accustomed to the unusual sight of Mr. Ashworth patiently cutting up a 3-year-old's food and answering endless questions about why fish don't drown and whether clouds have feelings. On their last evening in Singapore, Ethan's final obligation was the formal dinner with the Tokyo tech representatives, the meeting Jennifer had rescheduled at his request. It was being held in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place of hushed conversations and astronomical prices. Ethan had been prepared to attend alone, to slip back into his corporate persona for one final night. But at 6 o'clock, as he was adjusting his tie in his suite, there was a knock on the connecting door. Maria stood there with Isla, the little girl wearing a fancy dress that Maria must have been saving for a special occasion, her curls carefully brushed and tied with a ribbon. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Ashworth," Maria said, "but Isla wanted to see you before you left for your dinner. She wanted to give you something for good luck." Isla stepped forward, her small face serious, and held out a drawing she'd made that afternoon while Ethan was in his final meeting. It was another family portrait more detailed than the first. This one showed recognizable landmarks from their Singapore adventures, the Cloud Forest Dome, the aquarium, the hotel. And there, in the center, the three of them held hands beneath a banner that read, in careful crayon letters that Maria had clearly helped spell, "Promise kept." "So you remember," Isla said solemnly, "that you kept your promise. You came back every time." Ethan took the drawing with hands that weren't quite steady. "I will treasure this, Isla. Thank you. Will you come back tonight too? After your important dinner?" "I will. I promise." She nodded, satisfied, and then did something that made Ethan's heart stop. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small plastic bracelet, the kind given away at children's parties, bright pink and decorated with hearts. "This is for extra luck," she said, holding it up. "It's very powerful. I got it at my birthday party, and I've been saving it for something really important." "Isla, that's yours. You should keep," Ethan started. "But you need it more," she interrupted with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old. "Because you have to do important business things, and I want you to remember that we're waiting. Please." How could he refuse? Ethan held out his wrist and let her fasten the bright pink bracelet next to his platinum watch. It clashed spectacularly with his $1,000 suit, and he absolutely did not care. "Perfect," Isla declared. "Now you have magic and luck." At the restaurant, Ethan's appearance caused a subtle stir. The representatives from Tokyo Tech were impeccably dressed in conservative business attire. Ethan was equally formal, except for the bright pink plastic bracelet on his wrist that caught the light every time he reached for his wine glass. One of the executives, a sharp-eyed woman named Yuki Tanaka, finally couldn't contain her curiosity. "Mr. Ashworth, if you don't mind my asking, is there a story behind your accessory?" Ethan looked down at the bracelet, remembering Isla's serious face as she'd fastened it in place. He could take it off. He could make up some excuse. Or he could tell the truth. "It was a gift from someone very important," he said simply. "For luck in our negotiations." "It must be someone quite special," Yuki observed with a slight smile. "She's 3 years old and one of the bravest people I've ever met," Ethan said, surprising himself with his candor. "She taught me that some promises matter more than contracts." The conversation that followed was unlike any business dinner Ethan had experienced. Perhaps it was the bracelet, that visible reminder that there were other measures of success beyond profit margins. Perhaps it was the fact that he'd spent the past 3 days learning to see the world through a child's eyes, remembering what mattered. Whatever the reason, the dinner became less about negotiating terms and more about building genuine relationships. Yuki shared stories about her own children, the challenges of balancing family and career. The other executives opened up about their lives beyond the boardroom. And Ethan found himself talking about Isla and Maria, about the purple backpack and the kept promises, about how a 3-year-old had reminded him what courage really looked like. "You know," Yuki said as dinner was ending, "we've been considering this partnership for months. We've reviewed the numbers, analyzed the projections, weighed the risks. But I think I just learned the most important thing about Ashworth Technologies." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "That it's run by someone who understands that the best business is built on kept promises and genuine human connection. That's rarer than you might think in our world, Mr. Ashworth. They finalized the partnership that night, shaking hands on a deal that would expand both companies into new markets. But as Ethan signed the preliminary agreements, he realized that the real success wasn't the contract. It was that he'd learned to hold both parts of his life at once, the businessman and the human being, without sacrificing one for the other. When he returned to the hotel, it was past 10 o'clock. Maria answered his knock, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashworth. I told her she had to sleep, but she's been fighting it for an hour, insisting she needed to wait for you." Isla was indeed still awake, sitting up in her bed with both Bunny and Sing the tiger clutched in her arms, her eyes heavy but determined. When she saw Ethan in the doorway, still wearing her pink bracelet, her face lit up. "You came back," she said sleepily. "I promised, didn't I?" Ethan moved to sit carefully on the edge of her bed. "And look, your magic bracelet worked. We made a very good deal tonight." "Because of the magic?" "Because of the magic, and because you reminded me what's important. Now, I believe it's time for sleep. We have to be up early tomorrow for our flight home." "Home," Isla repeated, the words soft and satisfied. "All of us. Together. Like you promised." "Like I promised." She laid down, allowing Maria to tuck her in, but her eyes remained on Ethan. "Will you remember us? When we go back, and you go to your big house and we go to the small rooms." The question broke his heart because he understood what she was really asking. Would this trip be an anomaly, a bubble outside of real life that would pop once they returned to their usual roles? Would he go back to being the distant employer, and would she go back to being invisible? "Isla," he said seriously, "I'm going to tell you something very important. Can you listen carefully?" She nodded. "These 3 days didn't change just you. They changed me too. I've been living in my big house like it was a castle with walls to keep everything out, including people who might matter. But you didn't let me hide. You packed your purple backpack and refused to be invisible. You taught me that it's okay to let people in, that promises matter, that coming home only means something if there are people waiting who you care about." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "So yes, I will remember you. Every day. And things are going to be different when we get home. I don't know exactly how yet, but I promise you I'm not going back to the way I was before. You've made sure of that." Isla smiled, her eyes finally closing. "Good. Because you're not scary anymore. You're nice Mr. Etten who keeps promises." As her breathing evened out into sleep, Ethan sat for a moment longer, watching this small person who'd upended his life in the best possible way. Maria joined him, and they moved quietly back into the sitting area, leaving the connecting door open so they could hear if Isla woke. "Thank you," Maria said softly, "for all of this. You've given her something precious, proof that trust can be rewarded, that not everyone leaves." "She's given me more," Ethan replied honestly. "I've been so focused on building an empire that I forgot to build a life. She reminded me what I was missing." The flight home the next day was different from the journey out. Isla was a seasoned traveler now, confident in the routine of airports and airplanes. She sat in her seat coloring a picture of Singapore's cloud forest, narrating the details to her stuffed animals, occasionally looking up to ensure Ethan was still there. And he was. Always there, looking up from his work to answer questions, to admire drawings, to simply exist in the same space without the walls he'd built around himself. As they approached their home city, Isla pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar landscape come into view. "I can see home," she announced. "We're really coming back, like you said." "We're really coming back," Ethan confirmed. The car ride from the airport to the estate was quiet. Isla had finally crashed from the excitement of the trip, sleeping against Maria's shoulder. As they pulled up to the mansion, Ethan looked at it with new eyes. It was still impressive, the manicured grounds, the fountain, the pristine architecture. But it wasn't a home. Not yet. He helped carry sleeping Isla inside, Maria directing him to the staff quarters where she and her daughter had a small suite of rooms. It was comfortable but modest, a bedroom, a tiny living space, a bathroom. Seeing it now, after the hotel suites and adventures they'd shared, Ethan felt a sharp disconnect. "Maria," he said as she laid Isla carefully in her small bed, "I'd like to discuss some changes. Can we talk tomorrow, when you've rested?" "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Though if this is about, it's about a lot of things. But mostly it's about making sure this house feels like a place where a 3-year-old can laugh without worrying about being too loud. We'll talk tomorrow." That night, in his massive bedroom that suddenly felt even more empty than usual, Ethan couldn't sleep. He got up and walked through his house, really looking at it. The formal living room that was never used. The dining room set for entertaining that rarely saw guests. The study filled with awards and accomplishments that proved he was successful at everything except being happy. In his office, he pulled up the architectural plans for the property. There was an entire wing that had never been finished, rooms that had been intended for a family that never materialized. He studied the spaces, his mind beginning to work not on business problems, but on human ones. By morning, he had a plan. He found Maria in the kitchen, helping prepare breakfast while Isla sat at the staff table with her coloring books, chattering to the cook about their Singapore adventure. When Ethan entered, the kitchen went quiet. The billionaire owner rarely ventured into this space. "Good morning," he said, and was rewarded with Isla's delighted smile. "Mr. Eden, you're here. Did you see we're home? We all came back together." "I did see that, and I'm very glad." He turned to Maria. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" They left Isla with the delighted cook, who was already being regaled with stories about tigers and cloud forests, and moved to Ethan's study. Maria sat carefully on the edge of the chair, her posture tense with uncertainty. "First," Ethan began, "I want to thank you again for trusting me with Isla. This trip was meant to be about international business, but it turned into something much more important." "She adores you," Maria said quietly. "I've never seen her attached to someone so quickly. The feeling is mutual." Ethan pulled out the drawing Isla had given him, now framed and sitting on his desk where he could see it. "Which is why I need to make some changes. To this house, to how we live here, to a lot of things." He outlined his plan. The unused wing would be renovated into a proper suite for Maria and Isla. Multiple rooms, a small kitchen, space for a 3-year-old to play and grow. There would be a playroom, a garden area where Isla could explore safely. Maria's position would expand beyond housekeeping to estate manager, with a significant salary increase and proper benefits. "But that's not all," Ethan continued. "I want to establish a childcare program here. Other staff members have children or will. We should have accommodations for that, support for that. And I want to set up a scholarship fund in Isla's name for children of immigrants to help them access education and opportunities." Maria was crying openly now. "Mr. Ashworth, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay. Say you'll let me be part of Isla's life as she grows up. Not as a distant employer, but as..." He paused, uncertain of the right word. "As someone who cares. As family, if you'll allow it." "She already thinks of you that way," Maria said through her tears. "From the moment you knelt down and looked at her purple backpack, really looked at her and saw her."
Yes.
Yes to all of it. Over the following weeks, the estate transformed. Contractors worked on the new wing. Ethan rearranged his schedule to include time, actual, blocked-out time, for what he started thinking of as Isla hours.
Dinners together several times a week.
Weekend activities. Reading time before bed, where a billionaire CEO found himself acting out voices for picture book characters while a 3-year-old giggled with delight. The staff watched the transformation with amazement. The cold, distant Mr. Ashworth was learning to play, learning to laugh, learning to exist outside the armor of his corporate persona. 3 months after their Singapore trip, Ethan stood in the completed playroom, watching Isla explore the space designed specifically for her. There were bookshelves at her height, filled with the books they'd collected together, art supplies,
Toys.
windows that looked out onto the garden where they'd planted flowers together, and on the wall, framed and displayed with the same care as Ethan's business awards in his office, were Isla's drawings, the family portraits that chronicled their journey from strangers to something deeper. "Do you like it?" he asked, though her delighted squeals had already answered the question. "It's the best room in the whole world," Isla declared. She ran to him and hugged his legs, her new favorite form of greeting. "Thank you, Mr. Etten. You know," Ethan said, "you could call me just Ethan if you wanted. Or," he paused, the word feeling both enormous and exactly right. "Or you could call me Uncle Ethan if you'd like." Isla looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes, processing this offer with her characteristic seriousness. "Uncle Ethan," she tested the words. "Like family?" "Like family," he confirmed. She smiled, a sunrise of pure joy. "Uncle Ethan. I like it. Does that mean you're not going to leave? That you're staying for real and always?" Ethan knelt down to her level, this gesture that had become second nature now. "It means that wherever I go, I'll always come back. Because this is home, and your family, and that's what family does. They keep their promises. Even when you have to travel with your big suitcase? Especially then." He pulled out his phone and showed her his lock screen, still her drawing, but now joined by photos from their Singapore trip and new ones they'd taken together since.
"See?
I carry you with me everywhere. You and your mama. My family." Isla hugged him tightly, and Ethan held her close, this brave little girl with a purple backpack who'd refused to be invisible, who demanded to be seen, who'd broken through walls he'd spent years building and shown him what he'd been missing. That evening, as he tucked Isla into her new bedroom, a space that was completely hers in a house that was finally becoming a home, she asked him one more question. "Uncle Ethan, are you happy now?" He thought about it. About the Singapore deal that had expanded his company. About the other trips he'd taken since, some alone but many with Maria and Isla, combining business with the pleasure of showing a curious child the world. About the scholarship fund that was already helping 3 children afford college. About the way his house now echoed with laughter instead of silence. "Yes," he said honestly. "I'm happy now. Are you?" Isla nodded sleepily, clutching both Bunny and Sing. "I'm happy because I'm not scared anymore. And because you kept your promise. You didn't leave forever." "I'll never leave forever," Ethan promised. "That's what home means. It's the place you always come back to. And you've made this a home." As he left her room, leaving the door cracked open the way she preferred, Ethan encountered Maria in the hallway. She'd been listening, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You've given her the world," she said softly. "She gave it to me first," Ethan replied. "I was just too blind to see it. A little girl with a backpack had to show me the way home." That night, Ethan stood in his study, looking at the drawing that had started it all. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. A promise illustrated in crayon. A family created not by blood but by choice, by kept promises, by the courage of a 3-year-old who refused to be left behind. His phone buzzed with the next day's schedule, meetings, calls, decisions to make. But now, penciled in at the end in his own handwriting. Dinner with family. Non-negotiable. Because Ethan Ashworth had finally learned the most important lesson of his life. Success wasn't measured in dollars or market share or quarterly reports. It was measured in kept promises and shared laughter, in bedtime stories and crayon drawings, in the trust of a child who'd been brave enough to pack a bag and demand a place in his heart. And he'd given it gladly, discovering that the more he gave, the more he received. That home wasn't a building, but a feeling. That family wasn't about perfection, but about showing up, over and over, proving with actions that promises meant something. Outside his window, the estate grounds were peaceful in the twilight. Somewhere in the house, a 3-year-old slept safely, no longer afraid of suitcases or departures because she knew, really knew, that some people came back. And in his study, a billionaire smiled at a stick figure drawing and felt, for the first time in years, completely and genuinely rich. The smallest traveler had taken him on the most important journey of his life, the journey from isolation to connection, from existing to living, from a house to a home. And every day, with every kept promise, they continued that journey together.